towards the tail end of COVID, the pandemic. And we were all done with things, and my wife was out walking the dog, and she went to take my daughter to a birthday party, still wearing masks and so forth. And so she calls me on the phone, my wife that is, and she says, "Honey, I think I'm having a heart attack." Now you have to understand that this strong Black woman never complains of anything. She always is positive outlook. And so when she said to me those words of, "I think I'm having a heart attack," I knew she wasn't kidding. And I said, "Well, what's going on?" And she said, "Well, I started having chest pain when I took the dog for a walk, so I took aspirin." I said, "What?" She said, "When I dropped our daughter off and I'm here parked, I started having pain again. I didn't want to go in, and I don't know what's going on." Now, as a cardiologist, I knew the fact that there was a relationship between the COVID and increased clotting formation, of increased thrombotic events, of increased episodes in which a person may have strokes or heart attacks or clots in their lung. I immediately tried to mobilize things to get her taken care of, and yet still, when the paramedics came, they didn't want to take her. That somehow her symptoms weren't seen to be as relevant. So I took her myself as I arrived there, and she said, "Well, I didn't want to make a fuss." So I took her and drove her to the ER myself, the same hospital where I've implanted thousands of stents. But I didn't have my badge on. I didn't have my white coat on. I was wearing just a sweat jacket as I wheeled her up, and I was brushed off by the nurse taking care of her, who was a different complexion and hue than I was. I called my wife as I wasn't allowed to go in, and she said she was sitting in the waiting room by herself, not receiving the standard care and therapy that she should receive. And so this is what studies have shown. It's shown the fact that individuals of color oftentimes are less inclined to receive angiograms, less inclined to receive the appropriateness of care that can render effective therapy. We know that there are disparities that exist, and we see it on a day in and day out basis. As a result of this, we also see that heart failure, where the heart function becomes declined, it's increasing in African Americans and at younger ages. We know that the death rate from heart failure is exponentially rising in African American men, along with the hospitalization rates. We see not only this, but here's the key, that even if you're able to make it to 65, the number of years left to live, right, your lifespan, is markedly shorter if you're African American compared to white or Hispanic. That these studies have also told us that even at younger ages, the African Americans are more likely to be living with disabilities. That means that now this is impacting a domino effect. Now, if it didn't get worse than this, a recent study came out from Journal American College of Cardiology looking at estimates for the future that told us that we actually see in white individuals, the prevalence of cardiovascular risk factors and disease is projected to decrease, whereas significant increases are projected in racial and ethnic minorities. The question I ask you tonight is, why do Black Americans live sicker and die sooner? Well, W.D. Du Bois gave the answer a long time ago. He said to assume that in discussing the inhabitants of Philadelphia, one is discussing people living under the same conditions of life is to assume what is not true. We're not living in the same conditions. That our zip codes actually matter, that it doesn't matter if you're in DC or New York, New Jersey, Chicago, Detroit, around the country, that zip codes matter. That in certain segments of the population that are more affluent, where resources are delivered, that there is greater longevity. Why is it that African Americans live under different conditions than other groups? I pose to you, it's one area, it's one condition, and that's a 6-letter word, a dirty word called stress. Stress. Now, we oftentimes define stress as demands minus resources, and many understand what I mean by that is that if your bills total $3,000, but you make $2,400, you're stressed. If you have to pick up the kids at 3 o'clock, but you don't get off work until 5 o'clock, you're stressed. When the demands of life exceed the resources, we are indeed stressed. And this is something that we all have indeed experienced during the pandemic time, that we've been stressed beyond our means. The demands of life have been there, and we look at the key thing, we look at what's there. Many times in our communities, we have limited educational resources. That still yet in 2022 and beyond, we still have a lower graduation mark from high school and from college compared to other ethnic groups. We know that there's a relationship between individuals with educational prowess compared to those who don't in terms of the amount of disease burden that one has. The less education, the higher the disease. Now, there's multiple reasons for that. So we start to see something called the social determinants of health. This was data from Northern California Kaiser Permanente. They found that educational attainment and health outcome gradients persisted even in patients who had insurance, whose members have equivalent access to care, healthcare. This is significant. What's another issue that plays a role? Limited resources, financial resources, as we look at the history. As of 2016, the recent year for which data is available, you would have to combine the net worth of 11.5 Black households to get the net worth of a typical white US household. We see there's significant variances that are there. We see that when we look at Medicare dollars, we see the same thing translate, that health is more pervasive than we think. It's multi-layered, so much so that studies have shown beyond a shadow of a doubt that when heart disease is linked to financial woes, I've seen it. I've seen it in folks. Back in the day when you had to go stand in the telephone line to pay your bill, growing up in the inner city, right? The phone bill gets cut off. I'll never forget when I was just graduating from medical school, newly married. And that was just a couple of days late. And I have to admit, it wasn't financial woes because I just forgot. I was tired from all those sleepless nights. And the telephone company turned off my phone right during the holiday times. But so imagine when you don't have the resources to deal with that. And they say found the amount of stress that African-American men and women who had moderate to high levels of economic stress were 3 times as likely to have heart disease. So it's not just that plays a role in where we live too as well. And we understand issues that have come up that many have experienced who are individuals of color throughout your whole entire existence. These practices of redlining. I never quite knew exactly what unincorporated areas meant. I never quite knew why my dad would tell me, Columbus, make sure you go and make sure they didn't have like a dump. There wasn't a trash dump before you move in a place. That all these things that were the normal occurrence in communities of color. But you say that was a long time ago, Doc. But this recent 2022 New York Times article said discrimination seeps into every aspect of home buying for Black Americans. That's still in this day and age. But I want to tell you today, as a scientist, as a physician, that there is indeed a biology of this stress. This is not just something that is just sort of to the side that might happen, that we just observe as a relationship. That scientists have begun the process of really parsing down how this truly plays a role in the disease formation. That chronic stress, it triggers disease-promoting physiologic changes, right? And so these hormones are like these messengers. Think of it like, today's day and age, my kids love this Twitter and Snapchat where the messages will go away instantaneously. They're delivered and they vanish. That's like your hormones. They deliver a message and then they vanish. And so these messengers that happen as you sense stress, that you recall life-changing events that sit inside of an area of the brain called the amygdala that trigger and drive your sympathetic system, that revs your engine towards fighting or fleeing. This also triggers behavioral changes, causes us to want to eat more, causes us to want to drive towards bad habits, makes changes inside of our system there. It causes our vessels to crimp down, raising our blood pressure. It causes our liver to produce more, to break down the glucose or sugar, creating almost like a diabetic state. It causes mobilization of the inflammatory markers that are there. All these things begin to take place as we're under stress. And when this is persistent, this is the stuff that disease is made of. So these scientists have begun the process of looking and saying, well, does this really impact the heart, the vessels, the spine? Is there really features to suggest inflammation? And so these imaging studies have really heightened the fact that yes, indeed, there's a relationship, a distinct relationship between the stress upregulating this event that leads to the risk factors I just spoke about. Now, what's so interesting inside of all of this is that they've broken it down even into looking at levels of activation of this what we call the part of the brain, the amygdala, that stores your fears and apprehensions. right? And it compares that to your income, like we just spoke about financial woes, to the noise, meaning that the community that you live in. Has it been bisected and dissected by highways historically that leads to excessive noise, that leads to excessive micropollution? And so in a very similar way, we're seeing a direct relationship between the amygdala activity and or this sense of fear and trepidation and stress, as well as with income, along with noise and cardiovascular events. The correlation has been there, is what it's shown. You say, okay, well, doc, I get that things are activated, but how heart attacks happen? Well, the heart attack happens when these areas become disrupted inside the vessels. You may have seen this already, that your blood vessels are actually just like the skin. And if your skin gets a little bit of a pimple on the outside, what happens if it gets inflamed? It gets red, it starts to bulge out, and it may burst if you get a pimple, right? Well, that bursting that happens on the inner side of the lining of the vessels now causes a cascade of events where the body overreacts and tries to clot or heal that area. It does that through a substance called platelets, a compound. These platelets become activated and they stick together in clot forms. And so studies have shown that platelet activation and secretion occurs with increased catecholamine or stress hormone secretion. That we're seeing that how the behavioral stress not only increases inflammation, which disrupts the lining of the vessels, it increases the activity of your platelets. And so now it makes sense that why studies have shown, like this one called the Inner Heart study, that psychological stressors was a significant risk factor, and that the high levels of psychological stress had approximately twofold increased risk of heart attacks compared to individuals with low levels. And that you saw this, it was independent of, like, didn't matter if you had blood pressure, high cholesterol, diabetes, that just stress alone increased your risk. He's like, okay, doc, well, this goes for all Americans. We all be under this stress, but there is a unique stressor, the unique stressor of racism that seems to weather us. It seems to erode us slowly over time. That begins to happen. And this is what increased studies have begun to show us. And so W.B. Du Bois, we turn to him again. He argued that African Americans experience a unique form of stress referred to as double consciousness. All right, remember the movie The Butler had to wear two hats. When he was at work, he had to be one person and came home a different person. These microaggressions that began to happen, but W.B. Du Bois goes on to say, which resulted from the ongoing struggle to reconcile their identity as Americans with the reality of being treated as second-class citizens. Du Bois described this stress as a burden that African Americans carried and recognized its damaging effects on their mental and physical health. I propose to you that this is indeed the case. Another scientist, David Williams, researcher, Harvard, basically went in and he showed that something called everyday discrimination scale. Have you ever been treated with less courtesy? Have people assume that you're unintelligent? Have people assume that you're up to no good? That these microaggressions begin to lay the foundation of these micro stressors that lead to disease in a direct correlation. I'll tell you, I was sitting and my mind went to this just yesterday inside of the cath lab. I'm sitting there, I have my computer on, I have my phones laid out, I had my AirPods there. I had my water bottle, my lunch bag. Everything was on. I came back from doing the case and someone was sitting in my chair, had restarted my computer, disrupting all of my work, all the messages I was trying to answer with a stance of privilege and looked at me. Very interesting. And I began to wonder, was this because it's me or why was this done in this instance? Doesn't matter about title or anything else, but chose to go in and disrupt things there because they could. And so these studies have shown not only just that, but that when you observe things like the unfortunate events that continue to become a recurring basis in our society, that we visualize it, you're like, well, that doesn't have anything to do with you. Well, doesn't it? Well, studies have shown that in communities with high levels of frisking, these researchers found that increased levels of post-traumatic stress disorder, nervousness, and mental stress, not only by those who were frisked, who were touched directly by the law system, but also others within the community. That means just by watching the TV news. That means just by watching as you drive down the highway, that it can trigger the same stressors that as a person who's going through it themselves, that others have shown, other researchers have shown that living in minority communities with high concentration of I'll say adverse policing towards pedestrians was associated with higher levels of diabetes, obesity, and risk factors associated with heart failure. That there is indeed a relationship between stress, but also with racism. That studies have shown that there is a science behind it, that collectively the findings show first evidence that social discrimination is independently associated with high levels of that amygdala. Remember I told you about the fear factor right there, and functioning connectivity, thus clear parallels that tell us about discrimination and psychological stressors of other origins. That individuals who have these high levels of amygdala action have higher levels of inflammation, atherosclerosis. We just went through that. Studies done out of the American College of Cardiology that was reported showed that when you live in lower socioeconomic status, that you have higher amygdala activity once again, and that this predicts adverse events through a process of inflammation, right? And that we see this time and time again, that the arteries are affected. We see this time and time again, that as a result, many people of African descent have impaired lining of the vessel dysfunction. And all these things begin to happen. They have increased levels of C-reactive protein or inflammation that may be in part due to the stressors. That I want to tell you today that our health equals resiliency divided by stress. Resiliency divided by stress. Now, the problem is that many of us, we turn to fake resources because we feel that that's the only way to regain our stress, that stress equals demands minus resources. And so what we do, we turn to these fake resources, what are combined of avoiding pain, seeking pleasure, and exerting the least amount of energy. We turn to these bad habits that oftentimes focus around us going on double dates. We go out with Ben and Jerry. We go out and we have a little treat. Why? Because it gives us that rapid satisfaction. We sit down, and instead of engaging with others, we sit in isolation because we want to avoid the pain of conflict. We want this immediate satisfaction the sugar gives us because guess what? Stress is just simply desserts spelled backwards. And I want to tell you today that the food industry is not unique, that they have crafted and manipulated the food to make us say, we bet you just can't eat one. You can't eat just one. You have to come because it's comprised of the evil trinity of sugar, salt, and fat. These are the things that disease is made of. This idea that we're either adding to our resiliency or we're adding to our stress and components of health, that we can add through our nutrition, our food, to our stress, or we can choose to add to our resiliency. What is nutritional stress? Nutritional stress is created, of course, by the foods because of unhealthy properties. And yes, it's eating disease-forming foods, but it's also from not eating health-promoting foods. That studies have shown that there is a direct relationship. The more we're stressed, the more junk food we eat. The less we're stressed, the less junk food people tend to eat in general. That other studies have shown out of all across the population, who's more inclined to consume more fast food? That more non-Hispanic Black adults, that means us, that means me, consume fast food at a clip of nearly 43%. Not only that, we consume the largest percentage of daily calories from fast food, we consume the greatest number of daily calories from fast food. So what that means for some people is they like to live behind, but doc, it's a Beyond Burger. Doc, it's vegan cheese. Doc, these are vegan cookies, right? I want to tell you today, the enemy is the standard American diet, first and foremost. The standard American diet is what's causing detriment. And that consists of animal protein, that consists of salt, sugar, and fat in general, and we have to turn from it. But we also know that our meat consumption as African Americans tends to be on the highest side for fish and for turkey and for chicken and for pork, maybe slightly less for beef. That studies have shown that when you begin adopting an eating habit like this, study published inside of a major journal called Circulation, that when we consume fast food as little as once a week, it increases our risk of heart disease by 20%. If you're having fast food 2 or 3 times per week, that's roughly 50%. And if you're having it 4 or more times, that we're saying 80% increased risk, that there is an association just in proximity of living to these fast food restaurants, which many people of color do living in food disparate areas. The studies have shown that, well, doc, once again, it's plant-based, right? Well, sure, if you're eating the healthiest of healthy plant-based foods, your risk of coronary artery disease is at the lowest. But guess what? If you eat unhealthy, that means it melts in your mouth, not in your hands. That means it's filled with chips and cookies, snacks and otherwise, that these things are at a higher risk than if you were to ingest animal products. The studies have shown this processed food, it increases your risk of disease. But I want to tell you today, enough of the negativity. It's never too late to change the direction of your life is going in. And many of you have done that already from what I've seen. The great James Baldwin says, the wonder is not that so many are ruined, but that so many survive. I just presented to you reasons why so many of us should be ruined. The stress, it seems like the barriers are mounting up against us. But I want to tell you that there is a rose in the concrete. I want to tell you that there is hope, that we can create Black blue zones. How many of you guys have heard of blue zones? See, I'll tell you if you haven't. Blue zones are the most long-lived areas around the world. Whether or not you're speaking about Japan or Greece or Italy, or any of these areas, Costa Rica, you're looking at, but the only one in North America is in Loma Linda, California. These are areas that are comprised of the most long-lived individuals. That's why in the Bible it says in 3 John 1:2, it says, beloved, I pray that all may go well with you and that you may be in good health as it goes well, right? And so we understand that we can create Black blue zones, that there is a rose that instead God chose the things of the world considers foolish in order to shame those who think they're wise. And he chose the things that are powerless to shame those who are powerful. I want to tell you, it's about perspective. It's about perspective today, and many of you have embraced it, that our health is indeed tied to our resiliency or stress, that we have to quit looking at life from a fearful standpoint, from anxiety, that stress equals demands minus resources, and understand that you have limitless resources available to you. You have to look at life from a challenge response as opposed to a stress response. What does that mean? That when LeBron James comes down listen, I'm from California. I'm a Laker at heart, right? So I'm gonna go for the Lakers. Whether I'm talking about Magic Johnson, LeBron James, Kobe Bryant, if you don the gold and purple, I'm down with you, right? So when you come down that lane, you're primed to take that last shot. Why? Because it's not stressful for you. You're not receding. You're not retreating. You're advancing forward because it's a challenge response, that you're hopeful, you're excited, you're confident that you have what it takes. You have the resources, you have the tools at your fingertips, that when we begin to look at this, change our mindset, that yes, there's disease, but there's heterogeneity inside of the African-American community, that yes, we can look at the standpoint that many die of heart disease. But what about studies gone by years ago that showed that Black men actually experienced less significant coronary disease death than white men in studies out of South Carolina and in Georgia, right? Why was that? We need to look at studies differently, that yes, instead of saying that 50% of us develop high blood pressure, what about the 50% who don't? What's the secret sauce that's happening that allows a change and transformation? What about the individuals who are primed and prone towards developing kidney failure? That in these studies have shown that about 40% of African Americans from this particular study who also carried the high-risk features did not progress towards kidney failure. What about those individuals? Let's turn our attention to them. What about the individuals from the Dallas Heart Trial study that said African Americans commonly will manifest a couple of disease allele variants, right? And these things called PCSK9 variants, which are associated with larger reductions in LDL, the bad cholesterol. They actually identified this in African Americans, which led to the development of a medication that costs tens of thousands of dollars on an annual basis to deliver, to lower that bad cholesterol and help ameliorate. There's hope, there's resiliency inside of our community, that there is actually resiliency, the ability to recover, to adjust. This is what life has been like for people of color on this Black History Month, this Heart Health Month, that there is a study ongoing right now centered in the Black Mecca called Atlanta, Georgia. My wife is from Atlanta, right? Then this is kind of this Morehouse equity study that's being done. And what they're finding is very similarly to the blue zones, is that when you engage people and you begin to look at those people who live in disparate communities, but yet somehow seem to be a rose in the concrete, that they have activity with neighbors, they have a sense of cohesion, that they have a purpose in life, that they have a connectivity, that these are some of the things that stand out that also are associated with improved arterial health is what they're seeing, that there is indeed resiliency. But here's the key I'm going to talk to you about today, and many other instances I'll talk about what I call selfish. You have to get selfish. I'm not going to go into selfish today just because I had too much I wanted to cover, but I am coming out with a book on selfish. But I'm going to give you what it stands for. Selfish is the keys to unlocking your health. Selfish is a cardiologist's cure for a stressed and broken heart, the tools and the pillars of therapy that can transform your life. The S stands for spiritual, the E for exercise, the L for love, not love in the form of an amorous standpoint in this heart month, this lovers month. I mean, love, anyone who's loved before knows that love is not a noun, it's a verb. It means it requires forgiveness. That love means that you have to have gratitude, thankfulness. That love means you're volunteering, you're giving of yourself. This is what love is. It's an action word, and studies have shown the benefits there. The F stands for food, and that's what we're going to focus on. But the I is for intimacy of relationships. That studies have shown social isolation. It's like smoking 20 cigarettes of cigarettes. That sleep, the thing that we care the least about, that we tend to cast off if we're busy. Right? That sleep has so much power of transformation for our health and our mental well-being. And the H stands for the joy of life, the humor, the happiness. That simply laughing has power, and that laughing is medicine. But I want to focus today on food is as resiliency. Like Fannie Lou Hamer said, if you give a hungry man food, he will eat it. But if you give him land, he will grow his own food. And she let out astronomically in this. I want you to know that there is a rich history in recognizing the power of nutrition, the power that we need in order to live, to fight harder, that foods actually fight stress, cruciferous vegetables, spices, dark chocolate. Yes, darker the chocolate, the better. Legumes and fermented foods, that these foods also fight disease is what we see on a regular basis, that these foods fight heart disease, that green leafy vegetables, that individuals who ingest these dark green leafy vegetables, kale and arugula and bok choy and collards and so forth, that these things are tremendous and that they have upwards of 26% lower risk of ischemic heart disease, heart failure, and stroke. That we want to go ahead and make sure that we're getting these areas of dietary nitrates in, that when we begin the process of ingesting whole grains. Remember I said, you don't want the stuff that melts in your mouth, not in your hands. You want the stuff that you have to chew. I remember back in the day, you'd have brown rice, that had a hole on it. You're chewing. There's certain breads like Ezekiel 4:9, you chew till your jaw is tired. That's what you want. That's the stuff, because many of us are fiber deficient. It decreases our risk of death, decreased cardiovascular events. Beans are incredible. Right? Legumes are incredible. Your black-eyed peas, your red beans and rice, depending on where your pinto beans, all of them, they show an increased benefit as it relates to coronary heart disease as well. Our nuts and seeds are extremely important. Now, I didn't say butter, toffee, peanuts. I didn't say your salted nuts or beer nuts. Your raw, unsalted walnuts, Brazil nuts, hazelnuts. Those are incredibly great for your body, for your mind, and giving you the omegas that you need in order to process and decreasing depression. The spice of life, add those spices, cayenne, paprika, turmeric. These things are powerful as you begin to ingest these, and they play such a substantial role in the transformation of your body, helping to offset. And when you do this, what begins to happen? Well, studies have shown that when you adopt things like the legumes in the portfolio study, that you're able, it's comparable to taking cholesterol meds. You decrease the bad cholesterol. You decrease the C-reactive protein, which is a marker of inflammation. Those things that I showed you increased when you're stressed. That when you begin the process of eating lower salt foods, which means that just from the sodium from the food itself, and when you combine that with just fruits and vegetables and whole grains, that all of a sudden this lowers the blood pressure to the point that this is on par with these powerful medications that commonly are given, beta blockers and calcium channel blockers and ACE inhibitors like lisinopril and metoprolol, atenolol, and diltiazem, that there's power in nutrition to transform. It's what this shows. The further you move away from this line is what that shows. And we understand the DASH diet was based on a whole food plant-based diet that they felt people would not even be willing to adopt. They said, let's make it a little bit more palatable for people. So they allowed certain things, certain low-fat dairy and meats in order to make it more palatable. So we see the power that's there. The study that's been done by Dean Ornish too as well, looking at the power that the more, it's not about it's about effort, not about when you start, that when you're the most adherent with eating healthfully, with moving, stressing less, not smoking, that all of a sudden, guess what happens? That you start to have an improvement in the diameter of your vessels. They begin to dilate. That all of a sudden, that as you begin to become more adherent, that we see that there's not progression over a period of time in terms of narrowing, that we see a benefit that's there. These studies have continued. It's shown that the more you move towards eating a plant-rich diet, as opposed to Southern fried food, organ meats, processed meats, eggs, and sugar-sweetened beverages, that's sweet tea, that you're going to have a lower burden of risk of heart failure if you're not eating that stuff. That studies have shown too as well the sudden death. We understand that women are less likely to receive CPR and African Americans are less likely to receive CPR. We understand the importance of it just coming off of this January event with Damar Hamlin. We saw the impact and the timeliness of it, but to keep ourselves from coronary artery disease from reaching that, transforming our diet can have so much power in terms of prevention of sudden cardiac death, that we see that transforming our diet and moving away from the Southern dietary eating pattern of fried foods to whole food plant-based, we increase our survival. We decrease the burden of hard heart events. So when I look in general, there's a great study done out of the Veterans Administration, which essentially looked at veterans across the board, compared Caucasian veterans to African-American veterans. And what they showed is that when you have an unhealthy plant-based diet, your risk rises to nearly 50% risk in terms of having of longevity and so forth, of dying sooner, as opposed to a healthy plant-based diet. You have the lowest risk, and this is across the board. So it's not a race thing. There is no race except the human race, that we're essentially the same. It's a social construct. And studies have shown that when we feed our bodies the right stuff, we can avoid major disease. We can avoid cardiovascular disease when we have a healthy plant-based diet. That studies have shown that when we begin to do this process, we can wipe cancer clean and move down. We can wipe diabetes, that we don't have to live sicker and die sooner. The key is this, and this is what you all are doing, is that when we create this community, that when we move away from just me alone, but to we, illness becomes wellness. You've heard this before. If you haven't, this is some ascribe it to Malcolm X, others to other authors, but this is one of the key things, and this is what I'm committed to doing. This is what my organization is committed to doing, along with things like HeartSmarts is doing phenomenally for the past 10 years. We're new to this game. We haven't been doing it as long as HeartSmarts, but we are, as I wrap things up, we are looking to embrace a conference, and it's called HELP Conference, Health Equity and Lifestyle Project. And this conference is bringing together experts of African descent and passionate individuals across the country. And we are meeting inside of Huntsville, Alabama, to talk about the state of health inside of our communities, with diabetes, with heart disease, with maternal infant mortality, and with mental health and Alzheimer's. We're on day 2. We're actually going to explore, really look at the role of the community and looking at aspects of places of faith. What's the role of places of faith? And that's why your fearless leader is going to join me down there to bring her experiences to the group there too as well. We're going to look at places of higher education, looking at places of business, as well as hospital systems beyond their wall. But I want to encourage you all to continue down this path, right? The whole purpose of achieving health is not for you to hide under a bushel, for you to get into a new pair of clothes. It's not for you to go ahead and have to show off to your friends at church or at a reunion. The purpose of you being reinvigorated with health is so you can live a life of purpose. So now you're able to live that life that you're meant to live and do something with it. So I appreciate everyone's time and attention. I'm open to questions if anyone has them as it relates to any of the information that I shared.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Batiste. All right, everybody. So we have the best here with us. Whatever your questions are, please put them in the chat. Dr. Batiste said he doesn't have a hard stop time, and I told him he doesn't want to tell us that because we will keep him here. all night. So I say that to say, whatever questions you have about heart disease, about health disparities, stress, anything like that, please put it in the chat. And Dr. Batiste, my first question for you, can you share with everyone here your story? Because oftentimes when people such as yourself present for us, for whatever reason, people may think that you are somehow different, that you have not lived the same life that many of us have lived. And so this is easy for you, and adopting a plant-based diet is easy for you, and following everything you've said has not been a challenge. But can you share with us what your journey has been and your history, so to speak?
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And now I'll share a different aspect of the story is that it kind of started slowly. I mean, I grew up in Compton, California, and so surrounded like many of the food deserts and food swamps. And I never forget going with my dad. I want to ride with my dad wherever he went. And so we had this black car, called it the black car, of course, right? So some sort of Grand Marquis. And so I never forget that he would drive for a while to go to the grocery store. It never really resonated on me, the fact that we would drive for maybe about 20, 30 minutes to a grocery store. But I never forget walking in and seeing the fruit stacked up as soon as I went there, and how that was different than the grocery stores that were local where I was at. You fast forward throughout all of that, and I watched my dad pass away from diabetes, and I went through a dark time, you know, as a cardiologist, and just my inability to do anything to help save his life when I had been told I had saved others' lives, which was the hardest thing. But at that time, because I went into this place where I kind of stopped paying attention to stuff, I let my life insurance lapse. And so I started to read and research. I started to find out the power of nutrition. I started to find out that it's not about weight loss, that it's about transformation, about disease modification, and the power that lifestyle has. And as I began to adopt it, even at one point, my wife kind of hit me and was just like, "What are you doing? Why are you doing all these crazy things?" Because I said, I'm going in hard, you know, and I wanted to make a difference with my body and see. And so I started doing that. And so my financial advisor said, "Hey, listen, you let your insurance go. We need to get blood work done on you and get you set up for it." I was like, "Oh, well, let me get in shape. I need to hit the gym first. Let me hit the gym." She's like, "No, just get this done so we get this all over with." I went ahead and I got the blood test done. And so she called me back and I said, "Well, you know, I'll just take it again." She said, "No, you don't need to take it again." She was, "I don't know exactly what's going on. I've never seen this before, but I've never seen someone go from like okay or pseudo preferred to super preferred, and they got 5 years older." So that basically my testing and my measurements by the life insurance company, where their job is to try and figure out who's more likely to die versus who isn't, that older and adopting a whole food plant-based diet, that I had transformation as a result of the research that I did, as a result of the events of my father, that then led to me really impacting my patients in the form of kind of delivering information. I'll tell you, it wasn't easy. And it's not easy. So even right now, I am completely, strictly whole food plant-based. My family isn't. Now, what does that mean? That means that I have to know when I go to restaurants how to eat. I have to know that when I have people who are having food around me that might bring up some old memories, those old seeds that are there that I might want to partake, that I have to be able to resist, that you're not always going to have complete support around you. There's three things that you have to realize in life, and then I'll stop there, right? What do you want? What do you want? The second thing is, what will you do to get what you want? The third thing is, what won't you do to get what you want? You have to understand that. You have to recognize that, and you have to think about that as you go, and you have to keep that at the forefront of your thoughts as you're moving forward in your day-to-day interaction. Don't beat yourself up if you have one step back, right? Just push forward. And what's the next meal going to be like? What's the next day going to be like? How am I going to go ahead and improve from where I've been at before?
Excellent. Thank you. And so to follow up with that question, one of the areas that you focus on is the slave food diet. Can you explain more what that is?
Yeah, so the enslaved basically were forced to eat foods that they did not otherwise want to eat. So When my colleague and I really crafted the concept of slave food, I'll be honest, I was like, oh man, do we want to hit people hard like that? What's going on? And as we began to tease through, we were like, this is really a double entendre. It's multiple meanings. Yes, from a historical aspect, that people were forced to eat foods that were discarded, foods that were not ideal. And we all get tired sometimes of hearing some of that stuff. But in reflection, many of us, as I described, we grew up in communities, we may still live in communities in which all around us, it's almost like we're forced to eat certain foods, that all around us we're riddled with fast food restaurants, that all around us we're riddled with grocery stores that may have a lower quality produce that makes it harder to achieve the dietary practices that we want, that we're in this situation like this, that we're almost enslaved. And I think about the time I went to a grocery store when I was just starting on this journey. I had all these fruits and vegetables, arugula, Swiss chard on there. I had all this stuff. And you know how these grocery stores are. Well, they line the aisles with right there as you're checking out. All the temptations, everything just reaching back. Come on, you want this. You want me. And all of a sudden at the last minute, I grabbed that candy bar, my favorite candy bar, I put on the conveyor belt, and I looked straight up. And the guy's checking me out. He was like, man, I thought you must be the healthiest person I ever met. And he said, until I saw you're just like the rest of us, as he swiped that candy bar. So, man, give me that candy bar. I ate it real quick, threw the wrapper away, And so, that's the thing, is the fact that guess what ends up happening is the fact we live in these disparate communities that we're enslaved despite our best efforts. But that's not only the thing of slave food. Slave food is about resiliency, understanding that even though the enslaved forefathers that came before us, they also, what they do? They grew their gardens afterwards. They found a way to enrich their diets. That they made lemonade out of lemons. They found ways in which they could still craft. They grew collards and mustards and knew how to go ahead and tap into the earth. And that's what we have to do in order to survive, is we have to now transition and quit honoring the foods that we were forced to eat and rather honor the foods built on resiliency that many chose to eat on top. And there was a wide range of those things. So that's what slave food is really about.
And so is the, I guess, explanation meant to say that we should never eat these foods, eat them every once in a while? And I asked that within the context of culture. And
Sure.
for some people, these foods are tied to more than just something to eat. And it's tied to their culture, tied to their heritage, perhaps maybe not even considering slave food diet, but people from other countries and where their food is really a cultural expression for them. Is it
Yeah.
all or nothing?
It's never all or nothing, right? I think the key is in terms of understanding where you're coming from. Most of our traditions are traditions, and they're formed around life experiences that bring about good memories. It generates memories inside of us. And so the key is crafting memories around good memories around foods that also are enriching your body. But if you have some and you choose to have some, that's fine. What I would tell you is you want to focus on the majority of the foods that you're eating to be plant rich. So if I'm going in and I say, okay, I know I'm gonna have some X, Y, and Z. Okay, if I'm gonna choose to have that, I'm going in eyes wide open, but guess what I'm gonna have? I'm gonna have my big salad before. Make sure I load it up with this, that, and the other on there in terms of from a plant-rich foods. But it's never all or none. Life is not that. We're all on different pathways on this journey called life, and we all are going to have a different reaction to as well.
Okay, so Dr. Batiste, we're going to do a quick lightning round of clinical questions, right? So what is heart disease?
Heart disease is a condition that affects not just the heart, but also the vasculature. Vasculature extends from the head to the toe, which means it can lead to strokes. It can lead to what's called peripheral arterial disease, cramping or lack of blood flow in the legs. And in men, it can lead to impotence too as well, common driver.
Okay. What are the endothelial cells?
Great. So think of it like if you've ever done any time in the kitchen, you've used a nonstick cooking pan, and you have like the coating that's on it that prevents anything from permeating. You can drop water, whatever else, nothing will stick to it. That's like your endothelium, a thin layer of cells that's very reactive. It will cause the vessel to dilate, causes it to constrict. It prevents, it acts like Superman to prevent anything from infiltrating it and leading to atherosclerosis until it gets damaged from being bombarded. And once it becomes damaged, it can become a portal of entry for and develop inflammation. And we saw it really highlighted during the COVID pandemic as a portal of entry for SARS-CoV virus.
What is the connection between diabetes and heart disease?
Diabetes basically is the kissing cousin of heart disease. It goes hand in hand. We treat diabetics almost the same way. So diabetes essentially leads to an increased blood sugar inside of the system, either from a lack of production of insulin by the body inherently or a resistance to insulin. Insulin is one of those hormone messengers that tries to store excess sugar. When it can't do it, that sugar goes around. Essentially, think of it like this, layman's terms. It spikes the vessels, damaging them, and it crystallizes the red blood cells. So when we check something called hemoglobin A1C, we're basically seeing, well, what percent of your red blood cells are crystallized? The higher the number is, the more reflection of the pervasive nature of diabetes.
Okay. What is cholesterol, and what is the difference in the types of cholesterol, and how is that connected to heart disease?
Yeah. So cholesterol, it's a lipid or a fat substance that's there. Your body needs some level of cholesterol for your nervous system, but it doesn't need that from animal products. And so we know that there's your good cholesterol, which is H or happy HDL, your bad cholesterol, which is low density lipoprotein, and your small dense LDL, which is a reflection of it. And so I would kind of think of it as if I'm throwing a beach ball at a wall versus I'm throwing a targeted baseball through a keyhole area can be more damaging. The small dents can be very damaging to your body overall and the inflammation in totality. So these things will build up, and once they infiltrate, they can become oxidized or inflammation inside the wall of the vessel, and that leads to the vessel thickening and expanding. And think of it like that pimple example I gave you that spreads and expands inside the inner lining of the vessels itself.
What is hypertension? And you talked about this a bit in your presentation, but why does it affect African Americans at such a higher rate? And then also, what is the connection between hypertension and heart disease?
Yeah. So high blood pressure or hypertension means that the pressure inside the vessels is high, right? So that means high pressure. Think of it like your garden hose at home. If you have a low pressure water hose that's there, that pressure may trickle out and you have to put a nozzle on it, or you have to squeeze the hose to increase the pressure so the flow comes out faster. Then you have like a fire hydrant, right? Where you attach the hose on, it's at a high level of intensity. So imagine watering your grass with a fireman's fire hose. What's going to happen? It's going to disrupt the top layer of soil. It's going to destroy all the vegetation that's there. The same thing happens inside the body. When the pressure is really high, it disrupts the lining of the vessels, causing it now to have to become reactive. And it also affects the kidneys, the organs. Kidneys are one, also the heart, also the brain. Now, last analogy I'll give you is think of it just like, for instance, if any bodybuilder that's lifting weights and they're bench pressing or lifting weights, at a certain point in time, they're going to get tired if they have to continuously do it. The body is squeezing against the pressure, the high blood pressure. And so if it has to continue to do it, at first it gets thick and then it gets tired. At first the muscles get big and then they get weak. And that's what's observed inside of high blood pressure and why it leads to such a detriment. Why does it occur in African Americans? Well, here's the thing. It's not genetic, because what studies have shown is that if you begin to move on the same migratory pattern from West Africa to the Caribbean to the United States, you'll see an exponential rise in blood pressure as you reach the United States. That studies have shown that in West Africa, that the level of high blood pressure is lower in many instances than in Caucasians inside of America. That as you move to the Caribbean, it's a little bit higher. And as you move to the United States, it's at the highest point. So we see this trajectory. So it tells us it's more than, it's beyond, it's not genetics. That makes us start to believe that this is a social construct, that it's life experiences, that it's stress. And Jackson Heart Study correlated that discrimination and some stressors have definitely been shown to be associated with elevated blood pressure.
What is metabolic syndrome and how is that connected to heart disease?
Yeah, so metabolic syndrome is just like what oftentimes folks will say is I don't have diabetes. I just got a little sugar diabetes. I just got a little blood pressure issues. I just have a little bit of cholesterol. I have a little bit of increase. I have to increase my belt just a little bit. That's there. When you start to add up all those little things, it adds to a whole lot. So when you start looking at what we call central obesity or increased waist size, you look at slightly increased blood pressure. You start looking at increased cholesterol. That these levels together, it creates what's called metabolic syndrome, which is much more damaging than it is just full-blown diabetes without metabolic syndrome. Can be a predictor of adverse cardiovascular events. So knowing if you're one who doesn't like to weigh yourself, all right, let me just at least kind of see what my belt size is. And you should know what your blood pressure is. You know what your blood sugar is periodically, at least once a year. And you think of that not from a standpoint of fear, but think of it from the same way you would your bank account. You are not going to go in and just keep writing checks and not being certain how much money you have inside there, because you may not be able to cash that check. So same thing, your life's experiences, you have to understand what has the toll been in terms of disease by let me check up on this at least once or twice a year.
Okay, so you mentioned earlier that impotence is a sign, I guess, of heart disease. Can you elaborate more on that? And I guess more specifically, erectile dysfunction, how that's connected to heart disease?
Yeah, so it's what docs call the canary in the coal mine. So it is one of the first warning signs for men is that when there's impotence, of course, there's other causes in terms of psychological stress, but erectile dysfunction in the process of an erection requires you to have a normal vasculature as well as the nerve innervation. And so when that vasculature becomes narrowed, if it becomes clogged, you're going to run into issues. The analogy I give to folks is that if you use a little small coffee stirrer straw versus one of those big old boba straws, I don't drink that stuff, but my daughter likes boba, those big old straws like that, right? That's the difference as you start moving away from the heart and the aorta down to the penis, you're going to have smaller arteries. And so if those can clog a lot easier. And so we see this oftentimes in the combination of things. That's how they're interrelated. So oftentimes we'll immediately do screening, check cholesterol, work on nutrition, work on exercise, and studies have shown that when you process of doing that, you might be able to regain. And that's my message to men, do what you love. In order to do what you love, you have to do what you have to do.
Okay, and what is the connection between obesity and heart disease? And more specifically, why is abdominal fat more dangerous perhaps than other areas of the body?
Yeah, it's a great question. And so there is a concept. I'll start first with a concept called TOFI, thin on the outside, fat on the inside, which means you cannot judge a book by its cover. That sometimes people can have excess organ fat. And what that means is that organ fat can encase the heart, it can encase the liver, it can encase the intestines. And when that loops there, this visceral fat, we call it, that is metabolically active, it's inflammatory, and it's wreaking havoc throughout your body. And you can't necessarily ascertain that directly by just looking at someone. It's a combination. There's different testing that can be done. In general, external fat or obesity in general, what that leads to is we know that there's an increased risk of irregular heartbeats, to as well atrial fibrillation. We know that there's an association to as well with some heart dysfunction. We know that there's a constellation of events that begin to transpire, the effects on the bony structure, which then leads to decreased activity for many individuals, not all, but many individuals, right? That leads to bad outcomes in terms of patients and increases the burden. So that we see the association that begins happening. It's much more association. So the question really that amounts is the scale is different for everyone. And so there's research that's been shown that body mass index for African Americans, we have a greater muscle mass compared to Asians and compared to Caucasians. We can't use the same scale for everyone, but we all know what life is like when we get out the shower, right? And so we don't have to hide behind that. So if we're not going to at least at a minimum measure from a waist circumference standpoint, we can gauge if there's room for us to make improvements as it relates to our weight and our health in general.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to the questions in the chat. Is having a fast heart rate often and taking medication for it considered a symptom of heart disease?
It may be a form of heart disease. It just depends. So if saying a fast heart rate can mean so many different things, that's really a challenge to really boil down to what precisely that means. Some instances, it can increase risk for other events. Other instances, it may be fairly benign and we're using medications just as to treat and lower symptom burden. I think in general, I tell folks what's your hydration like, your stress level like, your sleep like, your exercise like, when they're suffering with heart rate issues, your caffeine ingestion and alcohol ingestion. Those are the key things I start with.
Can you elaborate on the dangers of a sedentary lifestyle on the heart?
Yeah, so there's a lot of correlative studies, which means that they've done associations and showing individuals who sit longer have poor event, or they have higher events, do poor survival. We know that individuals, that the more that you walk and move around, the better off you are. That it's not the fact that you have to say, well, I don't have 30 minutes, doc. Well, you can do 10 minutes. You can break it up. A moderate to light, low level intensity is extremely beneficial for your overall state of health. We know that it will help lower your blood pressure. We know that will help your mental functioning. That'll decrease and work on depression too as well. We know the power that's there, that there's actually studies that have shown that when you do a comparison between stents and individuals going through intentional exercise protocols of moderate activity, that they do better than individuals going through stents at a lower cost. And so it's powerful what can happen. This is in stable individuals, not those who are having acute heart attacks. And so there's a lot of power in the simple things in life. So what do I tell people to start with? Just park further away, right? Don't drive around until you find the closest parking lot. Next thing I tell you is take the stairs. You say, I can't take 4 flights of stairs, take 1 flight. Next thing I tell you is try to stand more, right? Do something called non-exercise activity thermogenesis. Get neat with it. That's all it is I'm just going to stand. I'm a pace while I'm talking on the phone. All these things help burn calories and can help your overall state of heart health. Fidget when you're there in the chair, move around, right? These people who have this nervous energy, they tend to burn more calories and have a greater projection in terms of their weight loss too as well. So there's a lot of power in all of these tools.
Great. Now everybody's fidgeting in their seat. Okay, what is edema and how is it connected to heart disease?
Yeah, so edema can be a lot of different things. That basically is where fluid basically leaks out of the vessels. So think of it like the condensation on the glass. That's there, a nice cold glass of whatever, of water for this purpose here, right? And inside of a hot weather, you have the condensation where you get the moisture outside the glass. Well, inside your vessels, that are there, your lymph vessels, your venous vessels, and so forth, you have basically extravasation of fluid that goes, or leakage of fluid into the soft tissue. And that swelling begins to happen. That can be from shifts in sodium, that can be from shifts in your protein content too as well. Not saying protein deficiency, but speaking in terms of those who are extremely malnourished, markedly malnourished, we can see that on occasion. But those are oftentimes, so it does not always mean the heart. It can be for individuals who have a weak heart. The heart normally squeezes 2/3 of blood out of it, which is 65%. When that heart weakens and is unable to eject the blood forward, that blood can go backwards and then go to the body has a difficult time returning the blood, and it kind of sits there and is static, so to speak.
What is metabolic acidosis?
Well, that's a little bit different kind of situation that tends to happen. Your body is looking to maintain what's called a homeostatic state, which means everything is kind of like inside of like Goldilocks, not too hot, not too cold, just right. And so even from a pH standpoint, and so when that pH drops low, right, that means you become more acidic there. And that can happen sometimes in severe diabetic states. It can happen in cases of lack of blood flow to organs. That can be from what we call sepsis. And when that happens, you get a buildup of lack of oxygenation to the tissues that leads to what's called lactic acidosis, and the whole process begins. It's a little bit more kind of chemistry. I think it would probably be easier to demonstrate that through a whiteboard in the future than a description.
So there are a few questions in the chat about an unhealthy plant-based diet. And it was interesting that you mentioned that many of the processed plant-based foods could be considered part of a SAD diet, so to speak, as well. And so in your opinion, what are the unhealthy things that people can eat besides the fried foods, things like that? But I think people are asking more about like the alternative meats and things like that? Like what's unhealthy?
Well, I think that we have to keep in mind everything in life is comparative and it's relative, right? And so if I'm comparing processed meat substitute, plant-based meat substitute to prime rib or to beef steak or to burger, whatever it is, then yes, it's going to be better. If I'm comparing that substance over to whole beans, red beans, pinto beans, yes, that's going to be worse than the whole beans. So everything's going to be relative. So I think the key thing is having awareness as you're going in. And so if you're choosing the Super Bowl weekend that I'm going to have a plant-based slider burger, okay, you're going in my eyes wide open. If you're like, well, I'm gonna have a slider, but I'm gonna make my own black bean burger. I'm gonna have a carrot hot dog or do whatever it is because I want to keep it 100 on top of what my approach is, then you're good, right? So everyone, you have to go in eyes wide open. So yes, are the refined chips and the sugary beverages and the plant-based vegan ice creams, are they going to be tasty? Are they going to still stimulate the sugar receptors and everything that's going to keep you wanting those foods? Absolutely. Are those foods being crafted towards taste buds and with the desire and purpose for you to keep coming back for more? Absolutely it is, right? And so it's not about vilifying food. It's about understanding what your why is. What do you want out of this process? And if what you want out of this process is you're becoming who you're going to be. So if you're wanting to be healthier, you're becoming healthier, you're becoming unhealthy based on all of the things that we do, what we put into our mind, what we put into our body, how we move, how we don't move on a regular basis.
Okay. Could you clarify the difference for people who are new to this between whole foods, plant-based, and vegan?
Yeah. So vegan is typically a terminology that's utilized to describe the absence of animal products of any sort, including honey for bees. And so it's not in relationship to the way in which the food is constructed or processed or developed, right? So that means, so I use the analogy of Oreo cookies. I could use chips, I could use cake, whatever it may be. And so we all agree probably that having cake for breakfast, lunch, and dinner isn't healthy, even if it's vegan, right? But what whole food plant-based is that's saying, I'm being intentional and trying to eat foods from the earth, foods that have been documented and demonstrated to help improve or decrease or reverse disease processes is what I'm doing. I'm eating foods that have been shown to be or associated with improvementation and improved resiliency to help me fight off disease. And so that's where the difference is. It's never all or none, but the focus is that I want to make sure I'm making a concerted effort to try and rebuild my health and reinstitute my health to the best of my ability.
And how do you balance being plant-based and your family not being plant-based?
I'll tell you pretty easy. I actually love the fact, well, that's probably not exactly true, but I've learned I can eat anywhere. If we go out to eat, I can find something to eat. I've learned how to do it. And I think that what that's done is it's given me empathy for those who are struggling on this journey. It's given me empathy for those who are trying to figure out their path inside this life, because I've seen it. And one thing that my job as a father is to plant seeds and to provide direction. So my kids early on were plant-based, right? They were. At a certain point in high school, I don't want them feeling as if they have to lie to me or that they're doing something that's horrible and it's a crime. If this is the worst thing they do in life is by not being completely plant-based 100%, I've done a pretty darn good job. But I tell them that my job is not only to enrich their mind, but their body in terms of their health potential for the future. And that's really the goal. So they have come back to me and they'll say, Dad, I want to be a little healthier. I want to get in better shape. Okay, I'm not eating any meats or anything like that now. We don't cook it at home. We don't cook fish, don't cook any of that stuff like that at home. But if they're out, they buy it. I don't buy it for them. I won't say no, but I mean, that's something I'm not doing. So I find a balance and I do it basically with love. I think when you do it with love, then people are receptive and they understand where you're coming from. If you do it out of being preachy and you're obstinate and you're like, you're a bad person, that's where you turn people off. And that's where families are broken apart over just a desire to improve the health.
Okay, so I think that's what the question was getting at. So in your house, it's not allowed in there. And so how do you manage that? Is it just a rule of the house that these things are not permitted inside, or it's just understood?
We don't cook it, but if they bring it in and they eat it, I'm not having a big issue if they bring it in and eat it. So I'm not like, oh, you can't believe you brought that in my house, you know? And I tell people, you have environmentalists, you have staunch animal rights, and you have health conscious individuals. I fall on the health conscious standpoint. I love the animals, want my environment to be better, but that's my main focus is on the health. And so part of that health is really understanding. So no, I don't restrict them from bringing it into the house, but I'm not necessarily trying to cook in the same pots that they're cooking other stuff, and they may not wash it right either, you know? So no, that's just being real. So if they push me to it and they're like, dad, no, I just really want this and I want to save money, I probably would allow them fish. They're not doing, certain things are not allowed. So they're not doing, so I guess I'm not as loving as I said. They can't do beef. They can't do processed meats. Those are class 1 carcinogens. Those are the things that are going to kill them. And so that's not allowed. I'm absolutely opposed to that completely. So, and they understand that, and they've been respectful of that, highly respectful of that.
Okay, and so can you elaborate on what you mean by that they're class 1 carcinogens?
Yeah, so I mean, you know, red meat, pork, lamb, these are the things that really our disease is made of, that studies have shown in terms of their carcinogenic potential is very high. Studies have shown a direct correlation with heme iron from these substances in cardiovascular events that are there on a recurrent basis. So that's what I mean. And that's where the big problem is from my perspective with having those above everything else. Those are red light foods. I actually believe chicken and turkey are kind of reddish too. red to yellow. I'll give it closer to that. But I tell folks the focus should be on green foods on a regular basis.
Okay. And are calcium supplements, do they contribute to plaque buildup?
No substantial studies to really validate that at all, that there's any relationship with that. Your calcium, for the most part, if you're calcium deficient or vitamin D deficient, that's there based on labs. I'm not aware of any studies to really validate that. I've never seen that, and I haven't looked probably for a couple of years, but I'd never seen anything alluding to that come across my desk.
Are there any whole food, plant-based foods that you recommend for someone with PV, polycythemia vera?
I'd have to look for specifics with that to let you know. And you know what? I am so sorry. I realized I had a work meeting that I completely forgot about. I just got so into this, and I saw I did have a meeting from 5 to 6 o'clock.
Oh no. Okay, so
tonight. So I do apologize.
No problem. I was pushing it as far as I could push it anyway. You've given us your hour. So thank you so much. And everybody, I don't know if you heard Dr. Batiste, but there's going to be a great conference in April, and you are all invited to attend. It's going to be in Alabama. So I will send more information about that. Dr. Batiste, thank you so much for your time this evening. This has been awesome. Thank you for your graciousness and for all the information that you've shared with us. And I'm just going to unmute everyone so we can thank you and you can get to your meeting. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Very informative.
Thank you so much.
Bless
Thank
you.
you.
Good, everyone.
Okay, good night.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Good night.
Good night.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Bye.